We are gathered here at an online roundtable event entitled Towards New Forms of Engagement, celebrating 100 years of Finnish ethnology. The event, which is, by the way, will be recorded. It's part of the 15th Congress of SIEF, International Society for Ethnology and Folklore, held online at the University of Helsinki in Finland. The theme of the Congress is Breaking the Rules, Power, Participation, Transgression. The theme of our roundtable discussion concerns ethnology's societal engagements, the social situatedness of ethnological knowledge, and activism in research. We are also celebrating the centenary of Finnish ethnology as an independent subject field at the University of Helsinki. The statute concerning the professorship was given by the president of then new Republic of Finland on July 1st, 1921. The first professor at Helsinki was U.T. Sirelius, who had been docent in ethnology since 1906. He started his work as professor and chair on November 4th, 1921. And actually the same year at Åbo Academy University, Gabriel Nikander started as a professor in ethnology, Nordic ethnology. The professorship there was established in 1919, so a little bit earlier than this one. The establishing of the chair of ethnology at the University of Helsinki was backed up by a longer discussion on the significance of research into primitive culture and its evolution, yet to be distinguished from the study of cultural history, which was regarded as concerning more developed culture. According to Emil Nestor Setälä, professor and a member of the Senate, who is the main protagonist here, the target of ethnological research is the origin of human culture, the history of man, human, who rises to culture and aspires to become the ruler of nature. Setälä had been inspired by Alfred Corte Haddon, a lecturer in ethnology at Cambridge University, and his paper, Ethnology, Its Scope and Problems. This had been translated into Swedish and published in 1911. It was same year in December 1911 when Setälä gave a presentation at the annual meeting of the Finno-Ugrian Society, one of the oldest learned societies in Finland, and defined the field of ethnology, its task and methods as Finno-Ugrian ethnology. The chair of ethnology, established in 1921, was defined as comprising primarily the material culture and customs of the Finno-Ugric peoples, but with a note that this focus should not impinge on or collide with the study conducted in the departments of folklore or folk religion. In Sweden, Nordic ethnology had become an academic field at the University of Uppsala in 1925, and in Stockholm in 1919, a bit earlier. The first chair in Germany was created in Hamburg University in 1923, and at Tübingen and Heidelberg in 1933. It is thus agreeable to celebrate the centenary of ethnology in Finland from a larger European perspective, and this is what this roundtable is about. It is also worthy of note, while ethnology and folklore continue as distinct fields in the Finnish academe, we are not excluding folklore studies when we are celebrating 100 years of Finnish ethnology. On the contrary, we are celebrating their independence and their cooperation. Let me start by making a reference to the Hanna Snellman, who is the Vice Rector and Professor of Vice Rector of University of Helsinki and Professor of European Ethnology. She turned 60 earlier this spring and stated in the major newspaper in Finland, Helsingin Sanomat, as follows, I quote, "When the chair was founded 100 years ago, Finno-Ugric ethnology belonged strictly to the national sciences. Its task was to support nation-oriented thinking and the idea of Finnishness," end quote. This statement serves as one of the many indications that the key assignment in ethnology is no longer constituted of assembling comparative cultural data from among the illiterates and semi-illiterates within and selectively beyond the ethnology's own national borders. I am here referring to the Finno-Ugric framework in earlier Finnish ethnology. The subject field at the University of Helsinki is now European ethnology, not Finno-Ugric ethnology. Today's ethnology is to an increasing extent collaborative and interconnected to a variety of identity environments. In accordance with the engaged turn of ethnography, research is geared towards social responsibility and engagement in civil activities, both transnationally and within communities. Scholarly activity is characterized by ethical and even political activism, especially regarding humanitarian and environmental concerns, sustainable development, and minority rights, including those of the non-human kinds. Citizen science and ideas of degrowth also attract ethnologists. One conspicuous aspect of the denationalization of the traditionally national sciences is the scholarly recognition of cultural heritage and rights of ownership to culture among previously marginalized ethnic, linguistic, religious, sexual minorities, and people with disabilities. In addition, minorities are now studying themselves, engaged in the betterment of their own position and representation. But how does the historical development acknowledge the gentrification of the ethnological and folkloristic folk into middle-class, reflexively modern consumers whose identities, both online and offline, are designed and narrativized by, for example, media companies and the clothing industry? On the other hand, how collaborative, engagement-oriented are ethnologists when the vox populi rings the sound of populism? Do we see populists as political opponents rather than as representatives of the folk or the vernacular? Or is ethnological, including folkloristic research, intrinsically populistic and have been since the times of Herder? But what we prefer to identify in our respective class societies as the cultural elite. And what about scientific objectivism? Will scholarly activity and political activity intermingle in ways in which scholarship becomes a handmaiden of explicit or tacit social and political agendas, even when adhering to the scholarly principles of accuracy and evidentiality? Or, on the contrary, does this development mean that ethnology will once and for all be liberated from the ideological and political agendas to which it was tied in its earlier history, when serving nation-state politics and the building of national cultures? In the spring of 2021, many academic people in Finland were shocked by the editorial in Helsingin Sanomat, the country's biggest newspaper, which said that research in the humanities and social sciences is more ideological than research in the fields that represent the core of science. Those in humanities and social sciences research who took to commenting on this argument saw such a distinction as contemptuous and or ridiculous. The core of science was not defined, but it apparently pointed to natural sciences, implying that they are free from ideology. Humanists and social scientists prefer to see all science and all scholarship as ideological. The problem here seemed to be in the negativity of the concept of ideology conveyed by the editorial. More ideology meant less scientificness, whereas in recent decades, humanistic and social scientific research has been characterized by a perception of the inevitability of ideology, which at the same time is perceived to reduce unconscious ideology and unconscious bias. Being ideological, therefore, does not go against being scientific. Another challenging area of activist research is constituted by cultural traditions that ethnologists and folklorists may wish to oppose or eradicate for ethical reasons. What does engagement entail in cases where human beings or other animals are being abused in the name of tradition and traditional cultural practices and values? Would it be possible that in addition to calling for strict legislation against violent traditions, scholars might engage themselves in designing better traditions together with the members of selected communities? One more question. Patriotism. In Finland, the Universities Act states that the mission of the universities is, among other things, to educate and raise students, I quote, to serve the country, the fatherland, and humanity at large. What would it mean to be patriotic in the currently globalist ethnology? I present these provocative questions to stir up debate, because debate is not only a crucial ingredient of scholarship, but also it constitutes its language and its rules of conduct. Breaking the rules that constrain social action and human thought is one of the motivations for activism also in scholarship. Breaking or transgressing the rules of scholarly conduct is hardly anyone's fantasy. So, with these questions, I started a debate and first introduce the first speaker, who is Professor Emerita Anna-Maria Åström from Åbo Academy University. And her title is Swedish Language Ethnology in Finland as a Form of Activism. Anna-Maria, please. Cannot hear you.
Thank you. Dear colleagues, one could ask if there are possibilities for being activists inside academia. First, I would answer hardly, then, of course. Broadening the field in different directions is possibly the best way of promoting new and controversial ideas. But what about outside academia? Are there more open borders for what can be done there? I am going to concentrate on two periods during the 20th century when some Swedish ethnologists and folklorists in Finland could be seen as activists, the 1920s and then again the 1990s. Thus, we also get a picture of our field during the last 100 years. I am thinking of activism as a cultural way of taking up important social and cultural questions. The ethnologists that I am talking about belonged and belong to the minority of the Swedish-speaking Finns, now 5.6% of the Finnish population. We must consider two things. First, the strong importance of the concept folk at each time, and then the context of the times that the scholars worked in. Let's begin with the context. After 1906, when Finland had got its one-chamber parliament with equal voting rights for all, even for women, the position of the Swedes in Finland had changed considerably. Within the equal rights, the Swedish had to be content with a new minority position. The newly established Swedish Folkparti had managed to win the support of the Swedish population that at this point consisted of 10%. We have to see the context as an outer context, where the position between the two language groups in Finland, the Swedish and the Finnish, had changed, and an inner context where the power between different sections within the Swedish population were adjusting to the new situation. Now, the concept folk will be helpful. According to Anthony Smith, in the process of nation building, the elite needs a people to justify the political position that it takes. The Finnish-speaking elite had turned to the people to gain its support and power, although a considerable part of the population had chosen a socialist way. The Swedish population was in fact divided in equal strata as the Finnish, with both administrators, craftsmen, and a large peasant population and a working class. Now, the Swedish ruling elite that was still left needed its own people, a condition that was acknowledged with the forming of the Swedish Folkparti. But a way of using a population for political purposes was one thing, and acknowledging it with all its characteristics and way of life was completely another. It is in this context that we will find the scholars that began to promote the culture of the rural population. In Helsinki, a new society had been founded in the forming year 1906, It was called Brage, and its aim was to save and promote the folk culture of the Swedes in Finland, the Finland Swedes, and to give performances based on it. From the start, laymen and academics worked side by side. This way of working in Brage can be seen as a way of activism. Why? Because this was out of the usual academic ways of promoting science, and its activities were different. Active here in Brage were anthropologists, textile specialists, folklorists, and musicologists, and many others. In 1922, the small group formed Brage's section for folklore studies to secure that the work in Brage stayed on a sound base. That is, it was based on facts about the culture. Authenticity was what counted. But working side by side with amateurs was also one way of showing to the more elitistic academic world that this was how the culture of the people should be honored. It was a way of digging into this culture and spreading the result to a larger community. How did they do it? They did it by founding a journal, Budkavlen, the name of which is expressive to the aim. It means a messenger that in the peasant society was forwarded from one farm to the next, informing important matters. Budkavlen, the journal, was now to inform and enlighten the people of where the Swedish-speaking population came from and what their roots were. The members of the section met every month to listen to academic lectures, collected information from the fields, and published both in the journal. The Brageites were not activists in the language struggles between Finns and Swedes, but they were activists in the inner context. They took a definite but unarticulated distance from the socialist forms of promoting the people, and they made the folk culture of the Swedes presentable to the informed public in Helsinki. They managed to test the hegemony of the upper classes and show that the folk culture was a valuable culture in itself. The other members of Brage, those who performed the folk dances and sang in the choirs, were migrants from the near countryside with straight roots to the culture that was performed. In Brage, they found a rural home in the urban milieu. To work side by side with academics must have been rewarded. Now, let's turn to the more turbulent years of the 1989 due to the fall of the Berlin Wall. A new generation of ethnologists and folklorists mobilized themselves anew and in the same Brage section for folklore studies. It was again in opposition to the established Swedish academic circles. As a member of this group, I can ascertain the following. Again, the concept folk was important. We wanted to show that ethnology and folkloristics had an important say to many problems of the times. Europe was not only coming together, but falling out in different sovereign nations once again. The contact to the Eastern European countries was reopened with many congresses that year. Here, the Swedish ethnologists wanted to enlarge their views on issues that could be looked through examining both folk and culture. Not at all the old folk culture of the Swedes anymore. Again, a new public forum, a journal called Laboratorium för Folk och Kultur, was founded based on the lectures that once again were held every month with many invited guests. The first number was considering the turbulent year 1989 from different angles based on international congresses in our fields that we all had participated in. Once again, ethnos and nationalism were moving forward on the ruins of the socialist states. Our aim was foremost to make our scientific fields important and known. We thought we had insights that were not common knowledge. The fields that were taken up consisted on everyday matters from prostitution to children's toys, from consumption to symbolism in the postmodern society. Our yearly conferences opened with music. We had Christmas feasts and spring excursions. We also sold our journal wherever we could, even on the streets, and arranged and participated in journal days during the book fairs in Helsinki. Again, the working methods were different than in the academic square. And again, the inner context was most important. The other members of Brage looked upon us bewildered but tolerant. What makes the work of the 1920s and 1990s comparable was an ambition to foster a deeper understanding of what lies behind the concepts folk and culture. A need to do so had showed itself at both times and almost in the same context. A problem was that the ethnological and folkloristical questions were not recognized as an equally important field than other cultural fields of inquiry. This was what the activists wanted to change, to cry out that our way of thinking is very important if we want to understand ourselves and the society. We chose promoting the concept's everyday life of all layers, and if the concept folk arose, it was handled critically. And in our times, we can ask ourselves, how do we manage in ongoing cultural and political debates? The pressing themes differ. As a personal commitment, I could tell you that I chose ethnology as a university discipline because of the environmental crisis that was already on debate in the beginning of the 1970s. I thought, here I will find the grassroots. An important question is thus, how can we involve us in different and perhaps questionable methods of changing the world? And we must be critical to ourselves also. Has any of such works that I have described now, has it had any meaning to the outer world? Thank you.
Thank you, Anna-Maria. Very interesting. Okay, so we have to move on. The next speaker is Inkeri Koskinen. She's a doctor and senior research fellow at the University of Tampere. Inkeri is not really an ethnologist, she's a philosopher of science. So she brings a special perspective to this discussion. Her title is, Can Activist Research be Objective?
Yes, thank you very much, Bertti. And thank you for the opportunity of speaking here. I'm very glad of it because I've been working on certain issues that quite closely bear on what you're talking about today. I'll try sharing slides now because I have some stuff that might be a bit might be easier to approach if you see it written too. So let's hope I manage to. Just a minute. Here we go. And now, do you see the slides okay?
Yes, we do.
Perfect. Okay. So I'll be talking about this question, can activist research be objective? And this is a part of work I've been doing on objectivity these last years. So it's a part of a research program, which I have only 10 minutes, so I won't be able to summarize the arguments for you. I'm just going to start with a very brief glance on what I'm claiming, rather than even trying to describe the arguments behind my claims. Let's start with a brief glance at philosophical discussions or discussions in philosophy of science about scientific objectivity in the last decades. So philosophers of science largely today agree that we cannot define scientific objectivity by saying that objective knowledge tells us how the things or the objects are in the world out there independently of us, simply because There are many reasons, but the easiest reason is just that that renders the whole notion completely useless, because we have no way of knowing what the objects are like out there independently of us, because all our ways of studying involve us somehow. So a pointless notion, if that's what it means. Another very popular understanding of what it means to be objective, or what scientific objectivity means, is that objective knowledge is value-free. Now, we could go into details here, but this is also something that has been very largely rejected in philosophy of science in the past decades for various reasons. I could spend half an hour on those reasons, but I'm not going to do it now. Just let us say that this is rejected. It doesn't work. And something that has also been recognized in the philosophical literature on scientific objectivity is that there are numerous other meanings of objectivity. For instance, if we find a phenomenon, a new phenomenon, using certain data and certain methods, theoretical background assumptions, and so on, and we claim that there is this phenomenon, and then we sort of find the same phenomenon using completely different data, different methods, different background assumptions, different researchers, so on, and we find the same phenomenon, then we can say that, yeah, that's objective. Clearly, that's one meaning of objectivity that we're using there. Another quite distinct meaning of objectivity would be using when we say that this research community is really objective. They have diverse competing viewpoints in the community, and there's lots of critical discussions which are taken into account, and mistakes or biases of individual researchers are corrected within the community. That's why the research community is really objective. That's a completely different meaning of objectivity, apparently. So once we've abandoned in philosophy of science these two earlier meanings or understandings of what objectivity and science means, we seem to have a large number of different meanings of objectivity that seem conceptually distinct. Now, my work on scientific objectivity recently, I have argued that these different meanings can actually be unified. What I'm claiming is that when we call something, a researcher, a community, a method, a result, objective, we say that we can rely on it and that others can safely do so too, because important epistemic risks arising from our imperfections as epistemic agents have been effectively mitigated. Important risks such as subjectivity, collective bias, idiosyncratic thought, cognitive bias, and so on. So risks that arise from the fact that we as epistemic agents are not perfect. Now, how does this bear on activist research? There are quite clear reasons to doubt the possibility of objective activist research, because activist research is heavily, overtly value-laden. It's often overtly political. So even if we agree that objectivity cannot mean value freedom, it doesn't mean that we can have non-epistemic values in any kind of role in research. We can't have wishful thinking presented as research. We can't have value-laden reasons for entirely value-laden reasons dismiss a hypothesis. Things like this are still considered biased. So is it possible that in research that is so heavily value-laden as activist research always is it possible to have the non-epistemic values, that is moral values, social, political, ethical, religious values, in a role that is epistemically acceptable, that does not bias the research? So clearly there are doubts. There are also quite good reasons for doubting these doubts. This is because activist research is often, I have studied Indigenous studies particularly. Recently, I've been starting to pay some attention to disability studies. There are clear examples of activist research where the activist research community has been able to identify and sort of raise into it the awareness of the larger research community issues and questions and viewpoints that have been disregarded beforehand, basically because the larger research community has been blind to them. There's been a collective bias, collective blindness that has created collective bias in the research community. And so activist research has been able, in many cases, time after time, to correct this. So it seems to be an effective remedy against collective bias in academia. And this seems to be like, perhaps it's increasing objectivity. And that's actually what I will be claiming here. Activist research can even simultaneously threaten objectivity, scientific objectivity, and increase scientific objectivity. Because as I claim that scientific objectivity has to do with epistemic risks arising from our imperfections as epistemic agents, and it has to do with effective risk mitigation strategies. This leads quite quickly to the realization that we have various things that are threatening scientific objectivity in each context where in science that we're looking at. We have various threats from, there are numerous epistemic risks arising from our imperfections as epistemic agents that we need to deal with. We need to deal with both subjectivity and collective biases. We need to deal with cognitive biases that we're prone to as Homo sapiens. And there are different risk mitigation strategies that need to be implemented. We might need many. So while activist research very clearly faces important risks, epistemic risks arising from our imperfections as epistemic agents, for instance, the role of, we might be so hung on to our non-epistemic values that we start using them in place of evidence and get biased results. Or we are, due to certain value commitments, we are unwilling to listen to outside criticism because we deem it as, okay, that's just political criticism. We don't need to listen to that. And the community becomes closed and dogmatic as a result. Clearly, these are important epistemic risks that activist research faces. At the same time, activist research can be a very effective risk mitigation strategy. So it can be the best available way for counteracting collective bias in the larger research community. Now I have taken exactly 10 minutes, so thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Inkeri. It was very interesting and challenging. Let's see. Let's wait for the discussion. Okay, so our next speaker is Professor Tuulikki Kurki from the University of Eastern Finland in cultural studies, also including folklore studies. And Tuulikki's title is Cultural Change, Publishing Research-Based Knowledge in Unconventional Forums. Tuulikki, please.
Thank you, and hello everyone. I hope my voice sounds good and you can hear me well.
Yes, we can.
Great, and thanks to organizers for inviting me to this panel. And give me a second and I will share my screen. Okay. My presentation moves to a very practical example of research trying to create societal impact. My viewpoint focuses on alternative ways of publishing research-based knowledge that potentially would make an impact on people's awareness of themes linked with borders, mobility, and migration in the context of Finland. In addition, the cultural change in my talk's title refers to a potential change in the academic publishing culture as well. I start with some background information. Recently, internationally and also in Finland, there have been several research projects that have combined ethnographic research methods and artistic methods in their working. For example, these projects have utilized ethnographic research methods with theater, dance, visual arts in different stages of research and published their results, for example, in cooperation with galleries and museums. During the past couple of years, scholars with various disciplinary backgrounds have also gathered to discuss how we could publish our results in other ways than through the traditional academic publishing channels, and in this way make our research more impactful and more accessible to diverse audiences. So in my presentation, the activism concerns mostly the question of making people aware of research-based knowledge, and in this way work towards making an impact and possible change. I'll exemplify this with a research project titled A Lost Mitten and Other Stories, Experiences of Borders, Mobilities, and New Neighbor Relations. This project is funded by Kone Foundation and it works in the University of Eastern Finland. Its main purpose is to increase understanding of experiences of mobility across various kinds of borders, identities based on mobility, and encounters across borders. These themes were examined by combining artistic methods and ethnographic research methods throughout the project, in gathering research materials, analyzing materials, and in publishing the results. The project included cultural researchers, linguists, literature researchers, and visual artists. During the spring and summer 2020, the project built an interactive exhibition together with the North Carolina Museum in Joensuu in the Eastern Finland. The exhibition was based on the project's main research themes: borders, mobile identities, dialogue, and new neighbor relations. In the project, the border did not mean only geographical borders, but also various kinds of political, cultural, linguistic, more or less visible and invisible borders in society. The exhibition was built around such objects that were linked in people's experiences with borders, border crossings, or not being able to cross the border, the mobile identities, as well as dialogue and encounters across the borders. In the exhibition, these objects were presented together with people's narratives of these experiences, and the narratives were readable as texts, audible in audio recordings, and these themes were examined also in drawings, animations, and art installations made by the researchers and visual artists in the project group. For example, in this slide you can see an installation, a triptych titled Injected by artist Päivi Saarelma. The pieces of installation were made of injection needles, medicine ampoules, syringes, and their plastic covers. It included also an audio narration. The triptych explored the invisible border between health and sickness in our society. The main themes of the project and the exhibition were further discussed in lectures and various kinds of workshops that were open for the general public in the museum space. The museum exhibition was also interactive, and it included elements of game, in addition that it could be walked around just like any other exhibition. Interactivity and elements of play were means to make other people's experiences visible and accessible to the museum visitor in ways that could create understanding by empathy, by interacting with an object through visual, haptic, and kinesthetic forms. The material objects in the exhibition functioned as multi-voiced instruments or plurivocal instruments, which is a concept by Susan Ball that exemplified such phenomena linked to borders and mobilities that are difficult to articulate in words, for example. These objects and artworks functioned as visual and haptic means of addressing these experiences that complemented the verbal means of narration. The project launched also a virtual interactive open access version of the exhibition in the autumn 2020. This version was implemented together with the North Karelian Museum and the company 360 Finland. Here you can see an image of that exhibition, and you can find the address of the exhibition in the title row. In this open access exhibition, the visitor can listen and examine the same objects, narratives, and artworks that were available in the museum exhibition as well. So the point of my talk is that even though a single research project can be fairly small in size, nevertheless, various interactive ways in exhibitions, various virtual means, also small projects have great potential to publish their results in ways that are open to a wider community than just the academic community, and thus potential to make an impact. For example, a virtual open access exhibition can be visited easily from home couch, piece by piece, and it becomes thus accessible in a very different way than, for example, through reading a 20-page research article on the same subject. In addition, the threshold of leaving home to an exhibition or to a gallery is much lower than leaving to a seminar, for example. And to sum up, here are my 3 points for discussion. First, single projects and single researchers can make an impact through virtual, experimental, and interactive forms of publishing in cooperation with museums and galleries, and in digital and virtual forms. And second, making impact through non-linguistic means, through visual and artistic means, and in this way reach such groups of people that are easily out of reach of the traditional academic publishing forums. And third, interaction, experimenting, doing by themselves, empathy are means to create understanding of other people's experiences and previously unfamiliar phenomena. These means of publishing include great potential that research could explore even deeper to make an impact right now. It's important that these kinds of experimentations in publishing would not be only short-term experimentations, but would be developed further. It is also important that these experimentations would not be realized just in terms of research or in terms of art alone, but dialogically together. I think that the experiments that are going on, for example, in Finland right now, have great potential to create something new in the field of publishing. And it's vital that people working around these themes right now are combining their forces to make the next steps available. And in matter of fact, researchers in Finnish universities working around these themes are right now working on a joint experimental publication on other ways of publishing, and several pieces in this forthcoming publication address also the question of activism in research and making impact through research. But maybe I will be able to talk about that later in some following seminar. But okay, these are my 3 points to discussion, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Tuulikki. That was very interesting, and definitely lots of material for the discussion later on. Okay, thanks. And our next speaker is Professor Konrad Kuhn from the University of Innsbruck. Konrad's title is Societal Responsibility and the Search for a Firm Ground in the History of European Ethnology. Konrad, please.
Yeah, thank you, dear colleagues. Being a European ethnologist doing research on disciplinary history, I feel honored to be invited to speak on the occasion of the 100th birthday of Finnish ethnology. I have some slides and I'll try to... In the following, I try to take a closer look at specific moments in which the concept of societal responsibility has played a central role and acquired eminent importance in the history of our discipline. Within the last 100 years, the aim of our scientific work as ethnologists and folklorists has changed fundamentally. With a romanticized view of peasant culture, our discipline was ready and willing to make a central contribution to the modern nation state, providing cultural arguments and thus resources for a collective identity that not only legitimated states, but also stabilized the hegemonial commissioning of the population as folk. This close connectedness to official politics, the proximity of our knowledge to serve in a functional way for official state politics has changed a lot, as we all know. It took a complex process within scientific organizations, together with shifts of epistemological perspectives and methodological innovations, to take us to where we are now. This process, which we have become accustomed to calling the reform of our discipline, had a starting point sometime around the early 1960s. A lot has been said about this shift in European ethnology towards contemporary social science, the methodological changes that accompanied it, and the simultaneous politicization of the subject's topographies of relevance. Mostly, it is simply said that the discipline recognized and fulfilled its social-political task only at that time. This often overlooks the fact that folklore studies, as an agency of collective meaning, has always been a discipline under the pressure of expectations regarding its relevance, and that its knowledge has always been in a specifically close relationship to society and politics. Against this background, the complex interplay of the use, deployment, and self-mobilization of academic disciplines and politics can only be understood as a reciprocal, power-infused, shared, and thus intertwined history, in which mutual interests, mobilizable resources, and shifting spaces of possibility shape action. My thoughts are kept in a light tone, also in view of the joyful event that the birthday represents. Furthermore, my comments are personal. They are based on the biographical perspective of a Swiss national now teaching and doing research in Austria. There may be some blind spots or even alpine mountains obscuring my view. I therefore ask for your understanding if I cannot present a comprehensive perspective of the historical development of our discipline, and that I'm by no means an expert on the specific Finnish situation. However, I take this opportunity to offer warm congratulations on the remarkable tradition of 100 years of Finnish ethnology as an independent subject field at the University of Helsinki. And these felicitations go out especially to all fellow researcher friends. To pay homage to this happy occasion, my starting point is closely related to the landscape of the discipline in Finland, although there is no time to delve deeply into this interesting but also highly complex history. In June 1947, the scientific journal Schweizerisches Archiv für Volkskunde, Swiss Archive for Folklore Studies, then edited by the folklorist Paul Geiger, published several texts by European researchers in their role as a sort of national representatives, whom he had asked for a brief overview of the work on the last few years and of the plans, about the plans that are being nurtured in the country for the future. With this initiative, Paul Geiger wanted to strengthen the communication interrupted by the World War and was convinced that as a neutral country, Switzerland could help to re-establish former links and promote international cooperation. Between 1947 and 1949, representatives from different European countries responded to the request and published short national overviews of the current research ongoing within their national context. Switzerland willingly serves here not only as a sort of relief agency for German-speaking Central and Western European folklore, but also for Northern Europe and the Baltic states. Switzerland had a centrally important function as proof for the existence of an unsuspicious, indeed apolitical folklore study. Their role as a neutral science was highly welcome, especially in German-speaking countries abroad, obscured by the functional services of the nationalized perspective on culture and people, which can also be identified here. The reply from Finland, written by Sulo Karlo Haltsonen, then working as librarian at the University of Helsinki, is of special interest here. In this job, he was very familiar with new publications and the state of the discipline, and answered in his brief overview of folkloristic research in Finland during the years 1939 to 1946. This was originally written in German, you see it on the right side, which I reproduce here in a translated version. He writes, "The recent war years have tested Finland and Finnish cultural life in many ways. But despite the hard times, scientific research has lived on, even during the days of bloody fighting. The results were, of course, sparser and smaller than before, but in many areas, much has been achieved. Above all, the earlier research work continues to have an effect on folklore. It was even made more difficult by the fact that the libraries and archives were evacuated because of the war. We also do not want to ignore the collecting work within the people." He then points out with satisfaction that the, quote, "university chairs were occupied by the same scholars as before the war." In these sentences, the barely concealed desire for continuity and normalization, the obvious efforts towards returning to a standard, and the desire for a continuation of scientific work become visible. These centripetal longings for a continued existence of the still young discipline, formulated here from a Finnish perspective, make clear in reverse how insecure and unstable the discipline presented itself throughout Europe after the World War. The political collaboration with the Nazi regime and the much less dramatic willing use of one's own analytical activities for political goals in other contexts and countries made extensive and profound argumentative efforts to stabilize and assign relevance necessary. However, since 1945, the questioning of the discipline was always present, smoldering as it were, and could only be concealed with difficulty. In some national contexts, this succeeded better. In others, the situation was more precarious. Especially since the European disciplinary landscape during the Cold War was not only divided by competing systems of scientific analysis, but also by, as you know, the establishment of a totalitarian regime of science in the Eastern European states. It was the efforts to create the Ethnology Europea, which were pursued from the 1960s onward, that aimed at new disciplinary perspectives and favored the comparative view above all. The formation of European ethnology within a loose alliance of interests was a result of attempts to overcome the crisis in which folklore studies found itself in the 1960s. A key person in this network was the Swiss-born Arnold Niederer, who consequently was one of the founders of the journal Ethnology Europea in 1966-1967. Early on, Niederer saw himself as an European ethnologist. His comparative cross-cultural interests had already been present well before the institutionalization of the corresponding research context. With his personal interests in the Southern European area, his affinity for languages, and his comparative perspective on the Alpine region and on cooperative work organized at the community level, Niederer, together with Sigurd Eriksson and Jorge Diaz and others, became one of the pioneers of European ethnology. They tried to overcome divisions between the different national and local ethnologies in Europe and aimed at establishment a new network of European ethnology. European ethnology thus became a science in the service of interethnic understanding, and science with a distinct claim of societal responsibility. Niederer took it up in the problem area of foreign workers. This was not a matter of abstract analysis, but of strategic calls for human cooperation. His applied research was intended as educational work for the authorities, employers, and public in the middle of heated debates around the migration issue, then called Überfremdung, a German term roughly translated as foreign infiltration. In doing so, folklore studies reached a current legitimization within the university as a renewed proof of a still small discipline. And this sort of academic research into European perspectives was also a concrete commitment against xenophobia. Consequently, folklore studies in Switzerland achieved attention, but these activities were not necessarily popular, in that its new societal engagement also went against popular opinion, which often reacted negatively. Niederer represented this social scientific reformulation of the old folklore studies as a science oriented towards the present, most prominently in his essay with the programmatic title on the societal responsibility of contemporary folk research, published in 1967. Needless to say, with his clear and early position, he was not only gladly heard in Scandinavia, but also in German-speaking countries. Consequently, some years later, the so-called Falkenstein formula for the reform discipline in Germany in 1970 contained the phrasing that the aim of the subject was, I quote, to contribute to the solution of socio-cultural problems, end of quote. Overall, societal responsibility becomes visible as a key cipher of the professional awakening of the late 1960s, which can also be seen in the sudden rise of the corresponding composites in publication titles. In the past few decades, societal responsibility has proven to be an extremely successful concept for our discipline generally. It has stabilized the discipline in crisis and opened up new possibilities in terms of relevance, epistemologization, and research field. It should be noted self-critically that the concept's openness to interpretation, which could also be called conceptual vagueness, had certainly been conducive for this success in the past. This functioning as a disciplinary centripetal force applies not only in the late 1960s of the disciplinary reform, but also and especially to the current research landscape, in which questions of European migration and security policy receive new attention. The examination of the consequences of the Anthropocene and the renegotiation of nature-culture boundaries are as pending as the political shifts in Europe and the rise of populist currents demand a critically scientific monitoring. These developments have also led to a significant increase in activism research and political engagement by researchers. And this has also led, as research on highly debated gender issues has particularly shown in recent years, to corresponding defensive and defamatory reactions, as we have seen in Poland, Hungary, or most recently Denmark. The future will therefore show to what extent the orientation of our heterogeneous discipline towards societal and political engagement will continue to have the same cohesive effect as it had in the past. In any case, it opens up possibilities for applying and deepening the insights into the social situatedness of our ethnological knowledge that are essentially linked to our self-reflecting thinking. In view of the generally tougher struggles for interpretative power in a crisis-ridden society, our engagement will also lead to more resistance from political opponents, which must not only be endured, but perhaps also countered even more. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Konrad. Very, very interesting. Good material, this one too, for the discussion. And we have had a variety of different entrance points in this in the presentations, and the next one is again different, where instead of having a speaker, we're having a film. So Professor Valdimar Hafstein from the University of Iceland, he has made a film entitled An Ethnologist Tries on a Pair of Jeans. And we'll be watching an excerpt from this film. The film starts off with notions of the cultural meanings of jeans as a consumer product for particular audiences with particular ideas of lifestyle. And Valdimar has discovered there's a tag attached to the jeans in which the manufacturer tells what is the cultural meanings of the product. And this takes Valdimar to some analysis on the role of the ethnologist in modern society. So let's watch.
Það ekki nóg með að framfarirnar séu samofnar gallabuxunum. Gallabuxurnar eru sjálfar ofnar í sögu 20. aldarinnar. Í gallabuxunum speglast bæði þáttur hlutanna í samfélagi og menningu og hvernig menningin og samfélagið búa í hlutunum. Þetta í sjálfu sér klassísk þjóðfræðileg greining á efnismenningu sem Levi Strauss býður upp á. Í greininguna vantar samt auðvitað margt. Af hverju skildu buxurnar til dæmis vera saumaðar í Póllandi? Hvaðan skildi bómullin koma? Samfélagsgerðin býr í hverjum og einum hlut í samfélagi og hlutirnir, heimilið og líkaminn endurspegla samfélagið og eiga þátt í að móta það. Við getum lesið margt, markvert og mikilvægt menningu og efnahag úr hlutunum, hvort sem við beinum athyglina að fatnaði eða húsagerð, matarháttum, kaffineyslu, ruslatunnum, bílaflota, sundlaugum eða hárinu. En það sem ég vil vekja sérstaka athygli á að þessari túlkun minni á gallabuxum er ofaukið. Það var nefnilega búið að túlka þær fyrir mig því ég keypti þær. Ég þurfti ekkert háskólanám í þjóðfræði til þess. Gallabuxurnar komu fortúlkaðar inn í búðina. Þetta er raunar eitt af einkennum samtímans. Æ fleira er fortúlkað. Merking þess er dregin fram sem hluti af vörunni sjálfri. Allt frá gallabuxum til borgarlandslags, allt frá slow food til fast food. Vörum og þjónustu fylgir nú orðið æ oftar frásögn, greinagerð uppruna, merkingu og menningarlega skírskotun. Levi's gallabuxurnar eru bara toppurinn á ísjakanum. Og hér er íseiskir frá MS og hér í lokinu er túlkunarlykill. Íseiskir. Og ég les, Ísey er kvenmannsnafn sem vísar í eyjuna Ísland. Til að heiðra þær íslensku konur sem miðluðu uppskrift og þekkingu og skyrgerð til dætra sinna í gegnum aldirnar, heiti skyrið okkar núna Ísey skyr. Hið sérstaka sjónarhorn þjóðfræðinnar, hugtök hennar og handbragð, er orðin svo útbreitt í samfélaginu öllu að eiginlega má segja að við séum öll orðin þjóðfræðingar nú til dags. Þjóðfræðin er þannig orðin hluti af sínu eigin viðfangsefni. Það er að segja að þjóðfræðilegur skilningur á daglegu lífi, þjóðfræðilegur skilningur á hversdeginum, er orðin hluti af hversdeginum sjálfum. Fjölmiðlarnir breiða þennan skilning út ásamt markaðsdeildum, auglýsingastofum, munnlegri hefð og auðvitað veraldarvefnum. Síðustu 2 aldirnar hafa þjóðfræðingar í ritum sínum og rannsóknum dregið sérstaka athygli að ýmsu sem var áður álitið algjörlega hversdagslegt og selvfölgilegt. Og leið hafa það gert merkilegt það sem þótti ómerkilegt. Og athygli okkar, hún breytir viðfangsefninu. Túlkun okkar og greining verða sjálfar órafar hluti af því sem það skýra, af því að fólk tileinkar sér þær. Næsti þjóðfræðingur kemur svo á vettvang og fylgist með hátíð eða spyr heimamenn út í hátíðina og fær að heyra frá þeim túlkun síðasta þjóðfræðings sem kom á vettvang, kannski fyrir 1 eða 2 kynslóðum. Og þetta eru mýmörg raunveruleg dæmi. En einmitt þetta er kannski tilgangur fagsins, eða einn tilgangur þess. Iðnvæðing, vélvæðing samgangna, fólksflutningar í þéttbýli, borgarmyndun, tilurð og vöxtur borgarastéttar, tilurð verkalýðs, stéttastjórnmál, ljósvakamiðlar, hagkerfi kapitalismans, allt þetta sem við köllum einu nafni saman nútíman, öllu þessu fylgdu róttækustu samfélagsbreytingar fyrr og síðar. Það rifu fólk upp með rótum, það gerbreyttu landslaginu, umbyltu lífsháttum kynslóðanna, sköpuðu nýjar hættur, óöryggi og eyðileggingu. En á meðal afraksturs nútímans eru líka alls konar úrræði til að kljást við afleiðingar hans sjálfs, úrræði til að glíma við hætturnar og vinna gegn óörygginu og lágmarka skaðann. Ein af þessum leiðum var einmitt að byggja byggðasöfn, að vernda minjar og móta allskyns hefðir og siði sem að vísuðu til fyrri tíðar, allt frá búningum til glímu til þorrablóta. Þar var breytingum nútímans lýst bæði sem framförum og eyðileggingu. Frá upphafi skapaði nútíminn sem sagt andstæðu sína, hefðina. Nútíminn hefur alla tíð verið kleifhugi. Hann fagnaði breytingunum, hann syrði breytingarnar. Og sem nútímafólk eru við líka kleifhugar að mörgu leyti. Við erum ósköp þakklát fyrir ísskápinn, en við höldum samt þorrablót árlega þar sem við gröðgum í okkur mat sem er varveittur með eldri geymslutækni. Við fögnum vélvæðingu en við syrgjum handverkið og við bölvum helvítis plastrúluböggunum þegar við keyrum hringinn og viljum vera millilega lausu sambandi við náttúruna út bílrúðuna. Við viljum bæði halda og sleppa, kannski aðalega sleppa en samt líka halda, smá. Nostalgían, þráin eftir liðnum tíma og horfnum heimi eru hluti af tilfinningarófi nútímans. Félagsvísindin, og þar á meðal þjóðfræðin, eru líka hluti af þessum úrræðum til að takast á við samfélagsbreytingarnar sem nútíminn veldur. Þjóðfræðin gegndi frá upphafi því hagnýta hlutverki að skapa nútímafólki tímaskyn. Byggðasöfn, að vernda minjar, ást við afleiðingar hans sjálfs, úrræði til að glíma við hætturnar og vinna gegn óörygginu og lágmarka skaðann. Ein af þessum leiðum var einmitt að byggja byggðasöfn, að vernda minjar og móta allskyns hefðir og siði sem að vísuðu til fyrri tíðar, allt frá búningum til glímu til þorrablóta. Þar var breytingum nútímans lýst bæði sem framförum og eyðileggingu. Frá upphafi skapaði nútíminn sem sagt andstæðu sína, hefðina. Nútíminn hefur alla tíð verið kleifhugi. Hann fagnaði breytingunum, hann syrði breytingarnar. Og sem nútímafólk eru við líka kleifhugar að mörgu leyti. Við erum ósköp þakklát fyrir ísskápinn, en við höldum satt þorrablót árlega þar sem við gröðgum í okkur mat sem er varveittur með eldri geymslutækni. Við fögnum vélvæðingu en við syrgjum handverkið og við bölvum helvítis plastrúlubökkunum þegar við keyrum hringinn og viljum vera millilega lausu sambandi við náttúruna út bílrúðuna. Við viljum bæði halda og sleppa. Kannski aðalega sleppa, en samt líka halda, smá. Nostalgían, þráin eftir liðnum tíma og horfnum heimi eru hluti af tilfinningarófi nútímans. Félagsvísindin, og þar á meðal þjóðfræðin, eru líka hluti af þessum úrræðum til að takast á við samfélagsbreytingarnar sem nútíminn veldur. Þjóðfræðin gegndi frá upphafi því hagnýta hlutverki að skapa nútímafólki tímaskyn, að móta meðvitund okkar samfélagsbreytingar og að túlka athafnir manna, tjáningu þeirra og efnismenningu í stærra samhengi í tíma og rúmi. Þjóðfræðin hér í eina tíð var fæið sem túlkaði rokkana og strokkana á byggðasöfnunum og allt hitt dóti líka, sögurnar sem fólk sagði hvert öðru og lögin sem fólk söng. Þjóðfræðingar túlkuðu, röktu uppruna, breytingar, fundu merkingu og sögðu sögur á sýningum í bókum og í fjölmiðlum. Eftir miðja 20. öld víkkaði síðan sjónarhorn þjóðfræðinnar. Frá daglegu lífi fyrri tíðar til daglegs lífs í samtímanum. Frá fatnaði, hreinlæti og matarhæfi fyrri tíma til fatnaðar, hreinlætis og matarhátta í samtímanum. Frá sambandi dýra og manna í gamla bændasamfélaginu til sambands dýra og manna á okkar dögum og þar fram eftir götunum. Ekki svo að skilja að þjóðfræðin hafi gefið fortíðin upp á bátinn, en brennidepillinn færðist líka fram á við í tíma. En eins og við sjáum innan í lífvagsbuxunum, ég valdi mér þessar hérna og þessar, þá voru túlkun þjóðfræðingar hluti af því sem þeir rannsaka. Hún smýgur inn í viðfangsefnin og snýr svo aftur í næstu rannsókn sem hluti af rannsóknargögnunum, sem túlkun sem kemur beint úr heimildunum frá heimildafólkinu. En er það ekki bara í besta mál? Til hvers ætti samfélagið svo sem að standa straum af rannsóknum þjóðfræðinga ef það má svo ekki tileinka sér þekkinguna sem þannig verður til? Eitt af einkennum þjóðfræðinar sem fræðigreinar er að hún hefur þróast með margvíslegum hætti í ólíkum löndum. Ekki vegna viðfangsefnisins, heldur vegna þess að þjóðfræðingar leggja sig eftir því að tala við landa sína. Þessa sömu og rannsaka og greina þeim frá því sem þeir vita þá. Það má lýsa þessu ferli sem hæggengri setmyndun, þar sem þjóðfræðileg þekking, túlkun og tilgátur hlaðast upp. Þessi setmyndun hefur síðan smám saman vaxandi áhrif á það hvernig fólk horfir á sína eigin menningu. Hlutina, húsin, athafnirnar, hvert annað og hvernig það lýsir þessari menningu fyrir fólki sem uppgötur hana, nýbúum, ferðamönnum og blaðamönnum. Þetta þjóðfræðilega sjónarhorn er engan veginn bundið við þá sem hafa menntun í faginu. Það fyrir löngu orðið hluti af sjálfskilningi menningarinnar, sjálfskilningi okkar allra. Með öðrum orðum er þessi þróun til vitnis stórmerkilegan árangur þessara vísindagreinar í að móta sjálfskilning samfélagsins. En árangurinn er ekki einhlítur. Sjónarhorn þjóðfræðinnar, hugtök hennar og handbragð hafa breiðst út en oft án gagnrýninnar, án brotsins. Þeim oftar beitt til að upphefja eða markaðssetja heldur en til að auka meðvitund eða stuðla breytingum. Þar hafa þjóðfræðingar enn verk að vinna. En þannig var þjóðfræðin til í upphafi. Hún kenndi fólki fyrir 100 árum gamla þjóðhætti, horfna siði og gamlar sögur í þjóðháttaritum og þjóðlífslýsingum og þjóðsagnasöfnum sem seldust eins og heitar lummur. Enda áttu þau þátt í því hvernig nýtt borgaralegt samfélag henti reiður á nútímanum. Þjóðfræðin varð í þessum skilningi aðferð til að fást við nútíman, fag sem að skapaði tímaskyn. En leið og við breytum skilningi okkar á hlutunum með svona túlkun, þá breytum við samband okkar við þá og þar með hvernig við umgöngumst hlutina og hlutunum sjálfum. Til að mynda gallabuxunum.
Okay, thank you, Valdemar. Very interesting film. So now I think we are ready for a general discussion. Valdemar will be one participant and all the other speakers, and we will be joined by Professor Nevena Skrivic-Alembijevic from the University of Zagreb, the president of SIEF, and Professor Bernhard Schaffen from the University of Zurich. So let's have a discussion. First, any comments, immediate comments that come to mind after seeing the film or after hearing other speakers?
Well, first of all, on behalf of the CF board, I wish to congratulate all of our Finnish colleagues on their great anniversary. CF sincerely appreciates their continuous and active contribution to our fields internationally, and this Congress held in virtual Helsinki is a proof of such an engagement. Due to an early internationalization of Finnish ethnology and the joining of European projects, the ways of CF and ethnological institutions and scholars in Finland have been intertwined from the very establishment of our society. So we have a long history of working together for the benefit of ethnology and folklore studies. 100 years of Finnish ethnology is an occasion worth celebrating, but also reflecting on our traditions and research approaches, on current tendencies and challenges, as well as on the paths we can take for the future of our disciplines. The organizers of this event have decided to do so by discussing new forms of engagement. And it is the concept of engagement I would like to highlight, and also bring in relation to other imperatives of contemporary scholarship, namely applicability and employability. The organizers of this event posed a question that has been discussed from different angles in previous presentations. What are the benefits and tensions when we put together socially and politically engaged disciplines and the scholarly principles such as critical analysis and objectivity, as relative as those principles may be? Of course, I do not see those two as different sides of an imagined academic polarity. As shown in previous presentations, our disciplines are not and should not be detached from their social contexts and isolated in the comfort zone of observing cultural and social trends from a distance. Participation, one of the key words of this Congress, is also a way we as researchers approach and get involved in the social realities we analyze, especially because we see the potential of research-based knowledge in the making of a positive change. At the same time, we are all aware that our disciplines are placed within a web of current politics and economies of knowledge. We promote the idea of ethnological institutions as instances of critical openness, free thought, and public engagement. Self-perception sometimes stands against the frequently promoted model of a self-sustaining, market-based, and financially independent provider of professional training and cultural services. That model focuses on producing applicable knowledge, as well as on designing projects that attract external funding. So how can we participate in the making of rules that would enable ethnologists to promote the freedom to critical instinct within societies, to paraphrase Wodak, and at the same time fit the requirements of audit cultures that regulate the institutions or projects we work on? To refer to the theme of our Congress, is there a way for our disciplines to break the rules of neoliberal policies in order to live up to our ideals? By becoming a capital, knowledge and the knowledge providing institutions and scholars have been reclaimed by concepts of utility, need, and demand. But that raises the question, what kind of knowledge is useful? What knowledge, on the other hand, is considered to be unwanted and unuseful? A knowledge of no practical value, and who gets to decide that? Shall we then reduce the parts of our work that foster systematic cultural analysis in order to boost the competence in project and culture management and deal primarily with the topics that are attractive at the market? Many of us are trying to find the middle ground, which is always a difficult position to maintain. This is a challenge we still face in our everyday practices of being ethnologists. Thank you.
Thank you, Nevena.
May I continue immediately?
Yes, you may.
Okay, thank you so much. Congratulations also from my side. Thank you very much for the opportunity to participate in this event together with Nevena on behalf of the SIEF, and thank you for your rich and really inspiring inputs, both from theory and practice, and also about Kalabuksan. I learned so much today. The theme above the presentations and our discussion not only fits perfectly into the program of this Congress, but is also highly actual and of fundamental importance. It is about nothing less than the question of the role of scholarship in society, about nothing less than the question of knowledge in society. I would like to share some thoughts with you in view of the occasion, the 100 years of ethnology in Finland. And my notes refer to three levels: a general one of the role of the humanities, one that tries to address the specific genealogies of our subject, and finally one in which I also discuss very briefly the self-understanding of SIEF as a scholarly organization of Menschenwissenschaft, human and social science. First, let me come to the general role of humanities in times of crisis and transformation. As we heard, we are all aware of the great challenges facing our societies, and we also know the challenges that this poses for the humanities. At the same time, their working methods and new self-conceptions are increasingly being called into questions, as we heard, not only by, but especially from the right. In addition, there are doubts about the seriousness of the paradigms and working methods of many humanities. This is especially the effect when it comes to our understanding of data and knowledge, as we understand as not as something given, but something that only comes to the fore in the process of reflecting. And this is also a problem if engagement for inclusive societies or for planetary well-being in the sense of a responsibly scholarship is brought to the fore. So if we are talking about ethnological legacies, maybe there is an asset in engaged reflection, or as we could term it, reflected engagement. Ethnology and folklore had, of course, been engaged disciplines of all letter, as we heard earlier. Like many social sciences, ethnology arose out of a concern for social development, but there was, moreover, a specific note. Modernization was often not the concern, countries after the Second World War and the end of totalitarian societies, there was a turn to sober science in our disciplines too. The main focus of the engagement was then at first often in the historization and orientation to the social sciences. Then from about the 60s and 70s, also increasingly in the deconstruction of the old myths and a critical turn towards the discipline's own legacies. Today, we must rightly ask ourselves what we have maybe lost through this, through this sober turn. Have we abandoned our fields to others? Have we failed to understand the rising populism? Not only a problem of today, but already beginning in the time after 89, maybe. It could be fruitful to revisit our public science traditions, mentioned earlier. And maybe this could also lead to a new role of SIEF as a mediator between academy and civil society. You all know the history of SIEF and its predecessors is characterized by this specific situation, by the interconnections between the academic and applied and the applied science. As we heard, this is both a burden and maybe also an asset. We have recently discussed these issues intensively in connection with the preparation of a position paper, SIEF and its role in the UNESCO ICH program, where we tried to bring to the fore our entanglement with the knowledge that that is very powerful in this field. So maybe SIEF is today on the way to a new self-understanding, a specific position that draws from the theoretical and methodological repertoire of our subjects to contribute to a democratic shaping of our challenged society, of our multiple challenged societies. But this, of course, is a path that is not simply to be taken, but one that needs to be negotiated in a broad sense in SIEF itself, but also still, as I think, in the national folklores and ethnologies, and with the background of a specific societal challenges that are not the same all over Europe and all over globally. Thank you very much. And congratulations again.
Thank you, Bernhard. Well, it happens to be that we're actually running out of time. And I regret that we wanted to have 2 hours, and now we have only 1 hour and a half. And we still have Kopeli Kok, professor of University of Helsinki, professor in ethnology, who's making the concluding remarks. But before I'd like to ask, do you have any immediate comments from any of this that we have heard? I'm so sorry that we don't really have time for proper debate. I was hoping for a real debate, but if you have any urgent comments, please say it now. Well, then in that case, Kopeli, please, the concluding remarks.
Okay, thank you. And well, I want to thank the panel participants for all insight you shared with us today, and also regret we don't have more time for a proper discussion, but I'm sure everyone will bring with them all this issue you raise and the good questions we need to ask ourselves and our field. So we've talked about the past, the present, and the future. And I will end this session with some humble reflections. And as a current professor of European Ethnology at the University of Helsinki, I will also close this celebration with a toast. So ethnology has changed as it's changing, as we've heard, in Finland, in Europe, and in the rest of the world. Early ethnology in Finland was a lot about local cultural history and with focus on Finno-Ugric people, folk culture, rural areas, for instance, and developing close relations to the German Volkskunde and the Swedish Folkhusforskning. Now it has diversified, as we've heard, and examples of our locally produced research in Helsinki include things such as academic cultures, urban studies, affects and emotions, digital culture, queer identities, digitalization of cultural heritage and education, knitting practices and their significance, and more. And topics of interest then and still now, albeit premises have drastically changed, include also work culture and working life, rural areas, and research with or about cultural heritage institutions like museums and archives. And there's also continuity in the mobility of exchange between ethnology in different countries, not least between Finland and Sweden. And ethnology is also increasingly more interdisciplinary. And I can take myself as an example. I was appointed professor of European Ethnology in Helsinki, despite of, or as it turned out, rather thanks to my unconventional academic path with a mix of folklore studies, Sami studies, digital humanities, and ethnology. And there are other examples. And we can also see how our doctoral programs, for example, are increasingly interdisciplinary and attract students with interdisciplinary background. So what this reminds us for the future, I think, is important of our disciplinary identities, maybe even more important when we collaborate with other disciplines, and not because we risk losing our identities, but as also might not recognize and acknowledge our contributions when departments and teaching programs are merged. Ethnology is also growing into a strong international field. And despite the confusion of terms that the multinational and multilingual contexts have somewhat brought, with ethnology, European ethnology, cultural anthropology, etc., our research networks, collaborations, and exchanges are solid and consistent. And this is nothing new, but our network have expanded and will probably continue to expand. And hopefully in even more inclusive and diverse ways beyond geopolitical and linguistic boundaries. Technology has changed and is changing, and things could not remain the same after we experience the reflexive turn, the engaged turn, as Betty referred to, and the vernacular turn, how relationships of ordinary people to expert knowledge has changed, as we can observe in discourses and actions, particularly in environmentalism or issues related to health. And of course, we have the internet and what has been called digital turn or participatory turn, as yet another significant factor of change. And as pandemics has taught us, if we did not already know, digital places, networks, tools, etc., are to be included in our fields of research or methods or approaches. Ethnology has changed and is changing, and ethnologists are highly engaged researchers and teachers. This engagement can take different forms and be positioned in various places on a scale of engagement and activism. We are trained into developing cultural sensitive approach, identifying and considering varieties of perspectives, and sometimes we have to take a stand. Things cannot remain the same when our societies experience new migration patterns that have a global impact, or climate change, its discourses, politics and consequences, or even pandemics, questioning our working life, socialities, and bringing to the fore, once again, social, economical inequalities within and between our societies. Ethnology engages with what is happening around us. There's this continuity of taking on social responsibilities that Conrad was telling us about. And as we meet social challenges, our research methods and perspective adapt and evolved. These are our tools to examine, question, challenge things, hopefully understand, and maybe make a change. I have been in the University of Helsinki for only 2.5 years, such a short time in a 100-year perspective. And I will soon move on to other adventures and commitment in our neighboring country, with which we have a long tradition of knowledge exchange, Sweden. And as much as things have changed in our disciplines, I have felt during my time here the heritage of a long research tradition, not only through the work of others who have been in this position before me, or their portraits on the wall of my office, but also in the responsibility I have received toward my colleagues and students. European ethnology is currently struggling with limited resources, economical resources and personnel. And this is something that will sound familiar to some of our delegates in the audience, as the threat of positions in humanities is unfortunately a problem that many academics are facing in different countries. The value of the work of my predecessors and colleagues and the engagement and promising work of our students give me confidence that the future of ethnological thinking, approaches, and perspective will perdure. Hopefully, the University of Helsinki can keep being the place for this. But one thing is sure, our perspectives, lenses and knowledge have an important role to play in society. And as we keep facing cultural and societal challenges, this importance will not decrease. So now I'll just give you a minute to fill your glass and get back to your screen and invite you to raise a toast for the 100 years of ethnology in Helsinki and Finland as one actor in the large landscape of ethnologists and allied. So let's now raise a toast for our predecessors in Finland and elsewhere, for us and the future of ethnology. Kippis, skål, and cheers.
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 Thank you, Coppeli. Thank you, all speakers. Wonderful, very good talks and very good film. Very, very insightful, Valdemar. And I thank the audience. So sorry that we couldn't really see each other, but hopefully next time. And this is really indicates that the ethnology is in good shape. Even we have to celebrate ourselves in such a virtual manner. But anyway, I wish everyone a very good Congress. Looking forward to all the papers and presentations and stuff. And thank you for this, and thank you Nomad ID for organizing this. It's a technical part of this, and thank you again the speakers. And see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Cheers.
Have a great conference.